We ended the last lecture on a bit of a puzzle. The question was why, according to Kant, duty, or obedience to the moral law, is the only possible motivation of actions that are truly morally worthy. And we were wondering in particular why acting out of love or out of sympathy or empathy, why that couldn't also count as moral action. And the answer has to do with what Kant takes the nature of free action to be. According to Kant, moral actions are free actions, and free actions are actions that are unaffected by one's emotions or inclinations. Kant's famous distinction here is between duty and inclination. I might have lots of inclinations, feelings, emotions, desires, most of them very idiosyncratic, particular to me, and so on. And they can certainly lead me to act in certain ways, but for Kant, an action isn't truly free, and certainly not morally worthy, unless it somehow rises above all that. We want the will, this faculty of my soul that is in charge of acting, in charge of making decisions. We need that faculty to be stronger than emotions, stronger than inclinations. We need it not to be ruled by those things. Because when it is, the will isn't truly free. And when the will isn't truly free, then you're hardly even acting at all, and certainly not acting freely, and certainly not acting morally. And so the idea is that it has to be only an attitude toward obeying the moral law. That is the only thing that can really serve as a morally worthy motive or intention for action. And we arrive here at what really makes Kant a deontologist. This is, as it were, the more narrow definition of deontology. Before we describe deontology as any sort of view that denies consequentialism, and that will do for most of our purposes. But originally the idea was that a deontologist holds that morality is about adhering to a set of laws or moral rules. That's what morality is, Kant thinks. And so the question that remains is just going to be what those moral rules are. Can we say something about what the moral law is? But Kant never doubts that morality is a matter of adhering to some laws or other, and we just have to figure out what those laws are. If you study up on Christian ethics, obviously a big part of Christian ethics is the Ten Commandments. There are various other laws that God ordains that are not enshrined in those 10, but it's the same idea at work there. The idea is that morality is about following some set of laws. Okay. Well, what is the moral law then? How shall we act? What does the law tell us to do? Well, this is really the most famous part of Kant's story in a way. This is really the key moment. Kant says, well, what sort of law could it be that could compel us to act in a certain sort of way? Especially now that we've ruled out the idea that there's anything good in itself other than goodwill. And we've ruled out the idea that it would make sense or moral worth to act on certain inclinations or emotions or feelings. Since we've ruled out all those things, what else is there for the law, as it were, to talk about or to refer to? We can't, for example, have a law that tells us to maximize happiness because happiness isn't always a good thing, according to Kant. It's not intrinsically good. Nor could we have a law that says to fulfill our desires because desires just aren't the right sort of basis, according to Kant, for grounding rational moral action. As Kant says, we have robbed the will of every inclination. And so what else remains? And Kant famously says here that what remains is the bare idea of law itself. What remains is that we should act according to law as such. What does that mean? He spells this out a little more precisely. The idea is going to be that whatever we do, there will be some kind of description, some kind of principle explaining how we are choosing to act, what the circumstances are, what our goals are, what our intentions are. And the old fancy word for this is a maxim. So Kant will talk about the maxim of one's action. And what Kant says is, we must act in such a way that the maxim of our action, the thing that spells out what we're doing, what our intentions are, not, of course, what the outcome will be, but what we have in mind to do, we must act in such a way that that maxim can be willed as a universal law. That is, morality has to be about following the law, and that means we have to act in ways that we could will to be laws. We have to be okay with the idea, in particular, of everyone acting as we choose to act in this moment. And that is the first formulation of Kant's theory. Okay, so the idea is, think about how you're proposing to act. Write it down in some rule, if you must, but give it some particular formulation. Call that the maxim of your action. Now suppose that that maxim is writ large in a universal kind of way, in such a way that anyone who finds him or herself in your circumstances will act in the way in which you are proposing to act. Now, if you are okay with that scenario, if you can will that, if you can desire it, if you would be willing to live in such a world, well, then your maxim passes the test, and that action thus described is indeed morally permissible. But if you cannot will that maxim as universal law, then the maxim fails the test, and you are in fact proposing to do something that is immoral. So let's see how this works with a couple of examples, or at least one. Here's maybe the most famous one. Consider, for example, when you are in a lot of debt, and you realize that one way out of this debt would be to promise to a friend that you will repay him if he loans you $100, when in fact you have no intention of keeping that promise, and you have no intention of repaying your friend. Okay, well, we can describe all that as the maxim of my action. The maxim of my action is, given these circumstances of need, I am going to make a lying promise to my friend to repay him should he loan me $100 or however much money. Okay, can I will that as universal law? That is, suppose that everyone who finds him or herself in my circumstances of need makes a promise to a friend that he or she will repay the friend money, but in fact has no intention of keeping that promise. Could I want to live in a world where people do this sort of thing as the rule of action? And Kant says, no, you cannot will that. Not rationally. You cannot really want to live in such a world where everyone makes these promises all the time with no intention of keeping them. Why? Well, because that would destroy the whole institution of promise-keeping, says Kant. Making promises is a kind of valuable part of human life. It's a valuable part of communication. And you cannot will its destruction, Kant says. And it is precisely that fact that you cannot will it that shows why this action that you're proposing to do is in fact immoral. Okay, let's stop there for now. One more lecture on Kant after this.